In the summer of 1973, a low-budget co-production between a Hong Kong studio and an American film company quietly rewrote the rules of action cinema. It was called Enter the Dragon, and it turned a Hong Kong-born martial artist into the biggest movie star most audiences outside Asia had never heard of. But Bruce Lee never got to see it happen. He died 6 days before the film premiered in Hong Kong and weeks before it opened in the United States. What most fans don't realize is that the people standing next to him in that film went on to live lives just as dramatic, tragic, and unexpected as the one Bruce never got to finish. A background stuntman became one of the most famous entertainers alive. A quiet actress walked away from fame and simply vanished. A karate champion reinvented himself as a professional tennis player. And at least one long-standing story about a cast member's tragic end turns out to be more myth than fact. This is what became of the people who shared the screen with Bruce Lee in his final completed film, and how differently their stories turned out. It helps to remember just how small and improvised his production actually was. Enter the Dragon was shot largely in Hong Kong on a modest budget, somewhere in the neighborhood of $850,000, a fraction of what a comparable American studio picture would have cost at the time. It was a co-production between Bruce Lee's own production company, Warner Brothers, and Raymond Chow's Golden Harvest Studio, put together specifically to give Lee a genuine international launchpad after years of frustration trying to break into Hollywood leading roles. Nobody involved, not the credited stars, not the extras filling out crowd scenes, not the stunt performers standing in the background of the tournament sequences, had any idea they were making one of the most influential action films in cinema history. Several of the people who appear only briefly on screen would go on to define entire genres of filmmaking in the decades that followed. That's part of what makes revisiting this cast so strange. Greatness and obscurity are standing in the very same frame, and it's not always obvious which is which. Start with a cast member most viewers forget entirely. Betty Chung, who played Mei Ling, the undercover operative feeding intelligence to Bruce Lee's character from inside Han's fortress. It's a small, functional role, easy to miss on a first watch. What almost nobody realizes is that the woman playing her was already a genuine star in Hong Kong before she ever set foot on Han's Island. Born in Hong Kong in 1947, Chung won a citywide singing competition at just 16 and quickly became one of the defining voices of Hong Kong's variety television era, recording in English, Mandarin, and Cantonese, and appearing for years on a long-running variety program, Enjoy Yourself Tonight. Her English was strong enough that international audiences frequently assumed she'd been raised in the United States. Enter the Dragon, released in 1973, turned out to be close to her final film credit. She wrapped up her acting career 2 years later, and by the 1980s, had stepped away from Hong Kong show business almost entirely. Before that quiet exit, though, she had spent years as one of the more versatile entertainers on Hong Kong television, hosting music programming and appearing regularly as a singer on variety broadcasts that reached huge audiences across the region. She married the well-known composer and arranger Chris Babida, later divorced, and settled into a quiet life raising her son. Today, Betty Chung is in her late 70s, living in Southern California, largely outside the public eye. Of everyone in this film, she may be the one who most deliberately chose to disappear, trading a career built on being seen and heard for a life spent almost entirely out of frame. Here's a detail that trips up even dedicated fans. The calm British intelligence officer who recruits Bruce Lee for the mission Braithwaite was played by British actor Geoffrey Weeks, a relatively minor screen presence whose few film credits made him one of the more obscure names in the cast. The actor frequently mistaken for that role is Roy Chow, who actually appears elsewhere in the film in an uncredited part as the Shaolin abbot who sends Lee's character on his mission in the opening scenes. Chow's own story is worth telling on its own terms. Born in Shanghai in 1927, fluent in several languages, he served as a U.S. Army interpreter during the Korean War before building a decades-long career as one of Hong Kong cinema's most recognizable leading men, appearing in roughly 90 films across 5 decades. Western audiences would come to know his face again 11 years later, when he played the ill-fated nightclub owner Lao Che at the start of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and again in 1988's Bloodsport. Off-camera, Chow was a devout Christian who founded a support fellowship for Hong Kong actors facing hardship. He suffered 3 heart attacks over the years, and heart disease finally caught up with him in April 1999, when he died in Seattle at age 72. Not, as some retellings claim, behind the wheel of the car, but from the cumulative effects of his heart condition. Anna Capri played Tanya, the glamorous, treacherous companion who glides through Han's island on the arm of power and menace in equal measure. She commands more screen presence in her limited scenes than her billing would suggest. Born Anna Marina Nasi in Budapest, Hungary, in 1944, she arrived in the United States as a young refugee and grew up working steadily in 1950s and 1960s American television before transitioning into a string of 1970s film roles. She insisted on doing her own stunt work on Enter the Dragon and reportedly came away with real bruises for her trouble. In interviews afterward, she spoke warmly of Bruce Lee, describing him as one of the kindest people she worked with, a small but telling detail given how many of his other collaborators independently offered the same description of a man whose off-camera warmth contrasted sharply with the intensity he brought to a fight scene. Capri's broader career stretched across 2 decades of American television guest spots on some of the most popular shows of the era, along with a handful of memorable film roles in low-budget genre pictures that have since developed their own cult followings. Her story ends far sooner than it should have. On August 9, 2010, a 5-ton truck collided with her car in North Hollywood. She spent 11 days in a coma on life support before she died on August 19, 2010, at age 66. Shi Qian played Han, the one-armed crime lord with the metal claw who anchors the entire film as its villain, a role so effective that it defined how audiences remembered him for the rest of his career. The real man was almost nothing like the character. Born in southern China, he grew up in poor health and reportedly took up martial arts as a way to build strength as a sickly child. He went on to appear in an astonishing number of films, commonly cited at somewhere around 300, over roughly 50 years in the Hong Kong film industry, and became so associated with villainous roles that fans affectionately nicknamed him King of Villains. One detail that surprises most viewers: Shi Qian barely spoke English, and Han's booming voice in the English-language version of the film was dubbed by another actor entirely. What's easy to forget, watching the finished film, is that Han is genuinely frightening largely because of how controlled performance is. Very little shouting, very little overt rage, just a quiet, unsettling menace that Shi Qian had refined across decades of playing villains on Hong Kong screens. He'd been working steadily in the industry since well before Bruce Lee was even a child actor, and by the time cameras rolled on Enter the Dragon, he was already a veteran in his 60s, bringing a lifetime of screen villain experience to a role that would end up being his most globally recognized. He far outlived his co-star, continuing to work steadily and receiving lifetime achievement recognition from the Hong Kong film industry before his death in 2009, at the age of 96 or 97, depending on the source consulted for his birth year. Few actors in the history of martial arts cinema logged as many screen credits, and fewer still managed to remain so instantly recognizable across 5 decades of shifting fashions in Hong Kong filmmaking. For an entire generation of moviegoers, his face became inseparable from the idea of the calm, calculating villain, a template that later Hong Kong and Hollywood productions leaned on again and again. Bob Wall played O'Hara, Han's vicious bodyguard, the man whose death at Lee's hands is one of the film's most memorable fight sequences. What makes that fight so convincing is that Wall wasn't faking his credentials. He held a genuine black belt at a high rank and was a long-time training partner and friend of Chuck Norris. Because Wall could actually fight, Bruce Lee used him to create the most dangerous-looking sequence in the film. In the scene where O'Hara attacks with broken bottles, Lee insisted on using real glass rather than the breakaway prop glass typically used in film, and Lee's hand was cut badly enough during filming to require stitches and briefly halt production. Wall later recounted that Lee warned him in advance the fight would be shot at real intensity, and that the contact during filming was hard enough to leave Wall with cracked ribs. Wall remained active in the martial arts and film world for decades afterward, working as an actor, producer, and instructor, and he frequently spoke in later interviews about how close he and Lee had become during the making of the film despite the on-screen brutality between their characters. He described a genuine mutual respect between 2 men who understood exactly what the other was risking to make a fight scene feel real. He died in January 2022 at the age of 82. Yongzi, far better known by a screen name Bolo Young, played the towering, near-silent enforcer, simply credited as Bolo, a role that became so identified with him that it effectively became his name for the rest of his career. His physique was entirely real. Young was a competitive bodybuilder who held the title of Mr. Hong Kong for 10 consecutive years and earned the nickname Chinese Hercules. Born in Guangdong Province in 1946, he relocated to Hong Kong as a young man and worked as a stuntman and actor for the Shaw Brothers studio before Bruce Lee, who had become a genuine friend during training, brought him into Enter the Dragon. 15 years later, an entirely new generation discovered him as the terrifying Chun-Li opposite Jean-Claude Van Damme in 1988's Bloodsport, a role that cemented his reputation as one of martial arts cinema's defining villains. In the years after Bloodsport, Young built a long working relationship with filmmaker Jalal Mary, who wrote roles specifically for him across several action films through the 1990s, keeping Young a steady presence in the genre well beyond his initial breakout. Now in his late 70s, Bolo Young is alive and, according to recent reporting on his life, still connected to bodybuilding and martial arts, living in the Los Angeles area with the family he raised largely out of the public eye. Periodic fake stories claiming otherwise circulate online from time to time. They aren't true, and Young himself has occasionally had to address the rumors directly through his own social media accounts. Marlene Clark had a small, easy-to-miss part in Enter the Dragon, one of the women in the orbit of the film's American leads. Her life away from this film, though, deserves far more attention than the role itself. A former fashion model from Harlem, Clark became one of the more compelling screen presences of early 1970s black cinema. Her best-known film, the 1973 horror drama Ganja and Hess, is now widely regarded as a landmark of black independent filmmaking, respected enough that filmmaker Spike Lee remade it decades later as The Sweet Blood of Jesus. Television audiences of the era also knew her from a recurring role on the hit sitcom Sanford and Son. Before any of that, in the late 1960s, Clark was married to Billy D. Williams, the actor who would go on to play Lando Calrissian in the Star Wars saga. Clark's screen presence in the early 1970s made her one of the more striking faces of that era's independent film scene, at a moment when opportunities for black actresses to headline serious dramatic material were still painfully limited. Rather than chase mainstream stardom at any cost, she gravitated toward roles in genre and independent films that gave her more creative range, even if it meant a smaller, less commercially visible career overall. She eventually stepped back from Hollywood and lived largely out of the spotlight for decades, resurfacing only occasionally for interviews as later generations of film scholars rediscovered Ganja and Hess as a genuine landmark of black horror cinema. She died in May 2023 at age 85. While Bruce Lee's career was about to explode globally, another martial artist on the same set already had an enormous following of her own. Angela Mao played Su Lin, Lee's ill-fated sister in the film's flashback sequence, a small, mostly wordless role for which she was reportedly paid only about $100. She didn't need the paycheck to matter. Born in Taiwan in 1950 into a family with roots in Peking opera performance, Mao trained in stagecraft from early childhood and later studied the Korean martial art Hapkido, which led to her discovery by director Huang Fong and a contract with the powerhouse studio Golden Harvest. Under the nickname Lady Kung Fu, she became one of the biggest action stars in Hong Kong cinema in her own right. One of her own films reportedly outperformed Enter the Dragon at the local box office. Decades later, filmmaker Quentin Tarantino drew inspiration from one of her fight sequences for Kill Bill. Mao married actor Kelly Lichin in 1974, had a daughter, and eventually remarried and had a son before largely retiring from acting by the early 1990s. She relocated to New York City, where she and her family have run a string of Chinese restaurants in Queens for decades, a detail that surprised fans and reporters alike when journalists eventually tracked her down for interviews years later, describing a woman who had traded international stardom for a life spent quietly running a neighborhood business, largely unrecognized by the customers she served. Old film posters featuring her in her prime reportedly still decorate the walls of the family's restaurant, a small, unspoken nod to a career most of her regulars never knew about. She's now in her mid-70s. John Saxon played Roper, the debt-ridden American gambler, who ends up fighting alongside Lee's character in the film's climax. How Saxon ended up in Hollywood in the first place sounds almost like fiction. Born Carmine Rico in Brooklyn, he was spotted by a modeling scout as a teenager and began appearing in pulp magazine photo spreads, including one striking image staged as a fake murder scene. That photograph reportedly caught the attention of Henry Wilson, one of the most influential and controversial talent agents in Hollywood history, credited with shaping the careers of several major stars of the era. Wilson renamed the teenager John Saxon and moved him to Los Angeles. Saxon spent years working to be taken seriously as an actor beyond his looks, eventually winning a Golden Globe as a promising newcomer and sharing scenes with Marlon Brando in The Appaloosa. Unlike most of his co-stars in Enter the Dragon, Saxon wasn't a trained martial artist, but by all accounts Bruce Lee respected his work ethic and gave him latitude to approach the fight choreography his own way rather than forcing him into moves that wouldn't look convincing coming from him. That collaborative dynamic between Saxon and Lee is part of what makes Roper such a believable underdog in the film's final act. He never pretends to be a match for Lee's character physically, and the film is honest about that gap. Decades later, an entirely new generation discovered Saxon as Nancy's skeptical police officer father in A Nightmare on Elm Street, a role that introduced him to horror audiences who had no idea he'd once shared the screen with Bruce Lee. Across roughly 60 years of more than 200 credits spanning television westerns, horror films, and action pictures, Saxon remained a working actor almost at the end of his life. He died of complications from pneumonia in July 2020 at age 83. Jim Kelly played Williams, the confident American martial artist who refuses to bow to Han and pays for his defiance with his life. On screen for only a handful of scenes, Kelly nonetheless left one of the most lasting impressions of the entire cast. He wasn't acting when it came to the fighting. Kelly was a genuine world middleweight karate champion who had already built and run a respected martial arts studio before Hollywood came calling. Enter the Dragon turned him into a star, and he rode that momentum into a run of 1970s films, including Black Belt Jones, becoming one of the first black action heroes many young audiences of that era had ever seen on screen. When film offers eventually dried up, Kelly did something almost nobody in his position tried. He reinvented himself as a competitive senior tennis player, eventually ranking near the top of the U.S. senior circuit. It's a strange enough pivot that it tends to